It started with a single act of cruelty, a store manager who looked at a man not as a person, but as a problem. The veteran had walked in quietly, head low, asking only for a sandwich. He wasn't begging. He wasn't loud. He was just hungry. But instead of compassion, he was met with laughter. The manager smirked, called him a disgrace, and ordered him to leave in front of everyone. For a moment, the world watched in silence. No one spoke. No one moved, until the sound of engines broke through the still air, the unmistakable roar of brotherhood approaching. Outside, the ground trembled as more than a dozen bikes pulled up. Black leather, chrome, dust, and power rolling in with the kind of presence that makes even pride take a step back. They weren't there for trouble. They were there for justice. One of them, a tall, gray-bearded rider with a patch that read Brothers of Valor, stepped off his bike, his eyes fixed on the store window. He had seen enough disrespect in his life to recognize it instantly. Inside, the manager's grin faded as the doors swung open and the bikers walked in. Not with violence, but with purpose. The veteran still stood near the door, too ashamed to move. But as the riders surrounded him, something changed. The same man who had been humiliated moments before now stood among warriors. Men who knew what it meant to bleed for others, to be forgotten, and to rise again. "You served your country," one of them said. "Now let us serve you." Those words fell heavy, not as pity, but as honor. The kind of respect that can rebuild a man's dignity piece by piece. The manager tried to speak, but the silence of the room was louder than any apology he could have offered. The bikers didn't shout, didn't threaten. They simply paid for everything the veteran wanted: a hot meal, new clothes, a place to rest. And then they turned to the others in the store. "This is how you treat a soldier," the leader said. "You don't laugh at scars you've never earned." The crowd, once quiet, now nodded in agreement. The tone had shifted. The lesson had begun. And in that moment, something remarkable happened. A room that had been filled with humiliation transformed into one filled with respect. The veteran, still holding his sandwich with trembling hands, looked around and saw not strangers, but witnesses to his worth. What began as an act of cruelty became a reminder that kindness, when fueled by courage, can shake the walls of indifference. And sometimes, it takes the rumble of 1,000 engines to remind the world that humanity still rides strong. The store fell into an uneasy quiet as the bikers stepped inside, not with chaos, but with a commanding presence that drew every pair of eyes. The veteran stood frozen, still clutching the humiliation that had just been thrown at him like a weight meant to break him. Yet now, surrounded by these riders, something in him began to straighten, as if their very posture lent him borrowed strength. The manager, who moments ago strutted with authority, now seemed smaller, shrinking beneath the silent judgment of men who had lived through storms far darker than any retail shift. One of the bikers approached the veteran with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his rugged frame. He asked for his name, and the veteran hesitated before answering quietly, "Daniel." Just saying it aloud felt like reclaiming something he had lost. The biker nodded, repeating his name with respect, and suddenly Daniel wasn't just a homeless man in worn boots. He was someone seen, someone acknowledged. From that point on, the energy in the room transformed. The humiliation that had filled the air began to loosen its grip, replaced by something far more powerful: recognition. The leader of the group asked Daniel what had happened. Not the dramatic version, just the truth. And Daniel told them, not in anger, not in bitterness, but with the exhaustion of a man who had learned to accept cruelty as part of survival. He spoke of long nights without sleep, of the loneliness that carved deeper wounds than war ever had, and of how all he wanted in that moment was a warm meal. His voice trembled, not because he feared judgment, but because he wasn't used to being heard. The bikers listened without interrupting, the kind of listening that heals more than words ever could. As Daniel finished, the leader turned slowly toward the manager. The man fidgeted, shifting under the weight of a silence that no apology could easily break. But the bikers didn't lash out. They didn't raise their voices. Their restraint carried more power than anger ever could. With a calm but resolute tone, the leader said, "Respect isn't optional, especially when it's owed." Those words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. The manager swallowed hard, the sting of truth beginning to settle into him. And yet, even in that tension, the bikers didn't seek revenge. Their purpose wasn't to intimidate. It was to restore dignity. They turned back to Daniel and led him toward the counter, making sure he chose whatever he wanted. In that simple act, the balance shifted. The room no longer revolved around humiliation, but around humanity. And for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt like the world hadn't completely forgotten him. Once Daniel had his food, the bikers guided him to a small table in the corner. It wasn't about placing him away from the spotlight. It was about giving him space to breathe, to settle, to feel safe. The smell of warm bread rose around him, a scent that stirred memories of a life before the streets, before the exhaustion. As he took his first bite, his hands shook, not from hunger alone, but from the overwhelming realization that someone finally cared enough to stop and help. Sometimes, kindness hits harder than cruelty ever does, because it reminds us of everything we stopped believing we deserved. The riders sat around him, forming a circle of quiet protection. Customers watched from their seats, some wide-eyed, others ashamed they hadn't stepped forward themselves. But the bikers didn't judge them. They knew what fear looked like. They'd lived through it. And they understood that courage didn't always roar. Sometimes, it arrived on the heels of someone else's bravery. Slowly, a few people approached Daniel, offering small words. "Thank you for your service. You didn't deserve that. I'm sorry." Each phrase chipped away at the wall he had built to survive years of being invisible. Meanwhile, the manager lingered by the counter, guilt tightening his shoulders. He tried to mask it behind forced professionalism, but everyone could see the shift happening inside him. His earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by something almost unfamiliar: reflection. Watching the veteran break bread among men who treated him like royalty struck him deeper than any confrontation. Sometimes the loudest lessons are taught in silence, and this one echoed across the store like a warning he couldn't ignore. Daniel finished his meal slowly, savoring every bite not just with hunger, but with gratitude he struggled to express. He looked at the bikers and asked quietly, "Why me? You didn't even know me." The leader leaned back, arms crossed, eyes steady. "Because you stood somewhere we've all stood," he replied. "Lost, tired, alone. And because no one who wore that uniform should ever have to feel invisible." The words hit Daniel like a sunrise breaking through a long night. In that moment, the weight he carried began to lighten, piece by piece. When Daniel finally lifted his head, his posture had changed. His shoulders rose, his gaze steadied, and for a brief, powerful moment, he looked like the man he once was, the soldier who had stood tall, fought bravely, and carried the weight of a nation on his back. The bikers didn't just feed him. They gave him back a piece of himself, a piece he thought he had lost forever. When Daniel stepped outside with the bikers, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, turning the scene into something almost cinematic. The roar of passing traffic faded beneath the weight of what had just unfolded. Daniel paused, gripping the sandwich wrapper between his fingers, feeling the cool air brush against his face. It had been years since he felt this grounded, not as a drifter surviving day to day, but as a man who still had worth. The bikers stood around him, not in formation, but in solidarity, creating a quiet space where he could breathe without fear of judgment. One of the younger bikers approached him with a small duffel bag. "This is for you," he said, placing it gently at Daniel's feet. Inside were clean clothes, a sturdy pair of boots, basic toiletries, and a worn but warm jacket. Daniel stared at the items, stunned. He had expected kindness to end at a meal, but these men were offering something far more valuable: a chance to rebuild. His knees weakened, the magnitude of the gesture washing over him. For a long moment, he couldn't speak. He could only feel, deeply, painfully, beautifully. The leader stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "You don't have to keep living the way you've been living," he said. "Every man hits the ground. What matters is who helps him stand back up." Daniel swallowed hard. Those words touched the deepest part of him, the part that still believed change was possible, even after years spent on the margins of society. He nodded slowly, as if agreeing not just with the biker, but with life itself. The circle of riders tightened around him, their presence like a shield against the world's indifference. Across the parking lot, the store manager watched from behind a glass door. His eyes were no longer sharp with arrogance. They were softened, shaken. Something inside him had cracked. A belief he had clung to about value, about appearances, about who deserves respect. Shame tugged at him, and for the first time, he felt the weight of his choices. He stepped outside cautiously, his voice quiet as he approached the group. "Sir," he said to Daniel, "I was wrong." The apology was clumsy, raw, but real. And in that moment, Daniel felt something he never expected. He felt seen by the very man who had tried to make him disappear. The bikers didn't intervene. They let Daniel choose how to respond. He looked at the manager, not with bitterness, but with a calm born from years of carrying burdens heavier than words. "Respect is free," Daniel said gently. "Don't forget that." The manager nodded, swallowing hard, unable to hide the regret in his eyes. It was a simple exchange, but one that carried the weight of transformation, the kind that stays with a man long after the moment has passed. After the manager stepped back inside, the bikers escorted Daniel to the row of motorcycles lined up like steel giants waiting for command. The engines were cold now, but their presence still radiated power, not the kind that intimidates, but the kind that protects. One of the riders handed Daniel a helmet, not as a gift, but as an invitation. Daniel stared at it, unsure. It had been years since he had ridden anything besides the harsh wind of the streets. But the biker simply smiled and said, "You're riding with us today." Daniel hesitated before sliding the helmet onto his head. Inside, the world felt different, quieter, contained, almost safe. The leader gestured toward the back of his bike. "Hop on," he said. Daniel climbed aboard, gripping the sides awkwardly, unfamiliar with the movement. But as the engine growled to life beneath him, something stirred deep in his chest, a spark of adrenaline, of movement, of belonging. For the first time in what felt like forever, the road wasn't something he walked alone. The convoy of bikes rolled out of the parking lot in a thunderous procession, their engines harmonizing like a battle cry of solidarity. Cars pulled aside. Pedestrians watched in awe, and Daniel, riding among them, felt the weight of his loneliness begin to crumble. The wind rushed against his face as the city blurred around him, each street a reminder that life could still carry him somewhere new. Every mile they covered chipped away at the pieces of shame he had carried for years. They rode to the outskirts of town, stopping at a quiet spot overlooking the vast stretch of open land. The bikers gathered around Daniel, sharing stories of their own battles, moments when they had lost hope, when the world kicked them down, when brotherhood was the only thing that kept them alive. Their scars weren't just marks. They were proof of survival, proof that even the strongest men fall, and even the broken can rise. Daniel listened, absorbing every word like water after a long drought. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in golden fire, the leader placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Brotherhood isn't about blood," he said softly. "It's about standing for those who can't stand alone." Daniel closed his eyes, letting those words sink deep into the hollow spaces inside him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a burden. He didn't feel invisible. He felt like part of something bigger, something fierce, something loyal, something unbreakable. And that feeling was the beginning of everything he thought he had lost forever. Daniel woke the next morning in a small room above the biker clubhouse, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of leather, motor oil, and pine. It was the first night in years he had slept on something other than concrete or cold earth. For a few moments, he lay still, unsure if everything from the day before had been nothing more than a dream born from exhaustion. But the distant rumble of engines outside, steady and familiar, reassured him that it had all been real. He sat up slowly, feeling a strange mixture of disbelief and gratitude wash over him. The world looked different now, softer, warmer, as if someone had turned the light back on after a long darkness. When he stepped downstairs, the bikers were already gathered around a long wooden table, talking, laughing, sipping coffee from heavy metal mugs. Conversations stopped when they saw him, but not in judgment, in welcome. One of them waved him over. Another pulled out a chair. Daniel felt awkward at first, unsure how to fit in with men who looked carved from stone and steel. But as soon as he sat down, the tension eased. They treated him not as an outsider, but as someone they had been waiting for. The leader slid him a plate loaded with eggs, bacon, and toast, more food than Daniel had eaten in a single sitting in years. As he ate, the bikers began sharing stories again, not about battles or violence, but about the roads they had traveled, the people they had helped, the mistakes they had made. Each story revealed a truth Daniel hadn't expected. None of these men were perfect. They had all fallen, all broken, all lost their way at some point. Brotherhood had saved them too. That realization softened something inside Daniel. The hardened part that had convinced him he didn't deserve help because he had failed one too many times. Here, failure wasn't shame. It was simply part of being human. After breakfast, they took Daniel to the backyard behind the clubhouse. There, under the shade of an old tree, were tables filled with tools, boots, jackets, and supplies the club collected for veterans in need. "We do this every month," one of the bikers explained. "You're not the first we've helped, and you won't be the last." Daniel stared at the rows of items, overwhelmed. He felt his chest tighten, not with sadness, but with a kind of hopeful disbelief. For years, he thought compassion was something rare, something most people had forgotten. But here, generosity wasn't an exception. It was a purpose. The leader handed him a fresh set of clothes and a small card. On it was the address of a local outreach center that worked with the club to help veterans find support, housing, and employment. "This doesn't fix everything," he said gently, "but it's a start, and we'll walk it with you." Daniel looked down at the card, then back at the men around him. The ground beneath him no longer felt unstable. For the first time in a long, long while, he believed he might actually have a future. In the days that followed, Daniel found himself slipping into a routine he never imagined he would have again. The bikers helped him gather documents he'd lost through the years, guided him to appointments, and stood by him during every uncomfortable moment, from entering buildings where he felt out of place to filling out forms that reminded him how much time he had lost. They didn't do it out of pity. They did it because they understood how hard it was to rebuild when the world expects you to do it alone. And slowly, piece by piece, Daniel began to reclaim the life he thought had died on the battlefield. One afternoon, while organizing donation bags in the clubhouse garage, Daniel found himself humming, a small habit he hadn't noticed he'd lost. Music once played a big part of his life, but war, trauma, and homelessness had stripped him of the desire to sing or even smile. Yet now, a tune slipped out without permission. One of the bikers heard him and laughed. "Man's got rhythm," he said. Daniel chuckled shyly, surprised at himself. Moments like these, simple, pure, human, reminded him he was still capable of feeling joy. The transformation wasn't instant. Some days were harder than others. There were mornings when memories of the past dragged him down, when guilt clouded his mind, when the world still felt too heavy. But the bikers never pressured him to be fine. They gave him space to struggle, to breathe, to heal at his own pace. Healing, he learned, wasn't about forgetting what hurt. It was about giving the pain somewhere to rest so it didn't crush him anymore. And knowing he wasn't facing that process alone made all the difference. One evening, after a long day at the outreach center, Daniel sat outside the clubhouse watching the sunset streak the sky in soft shades of gold and red. The leader joined him silently, both men letting the moment pass without conversation. Then, after a long pause, the leader said, "You know, the world didn't give you a fair hand, but you're still here. That means something." Daniel exhaled slowly, feeling those words land deep in his chest. Surviving wasn't just luck. It was a sign that his story wasn't finished yet. As night settled, the bikers prepared their motorcycles for another ride. Not for confrontation, but for purpose. They invited Daniel to join them again. This time, he didn't hesitate. He put on the jacket they'd given him, climbed onto the bike, and let the engine rumble beneath him like a heartbeat returning to life. The convoy rolled out together, lights slicing through the night, each beam a reminder that even the darkest roads can be illuminated when people choose to ride beside you instead of leaving you behind. As days turned into weeks, Daniel began rediscovering pieces of himself he'd long forgotten: strength, curiosity, even a quiet confidence. The outreach center paired him with a counselor who specialized in veterans reintegration, and although the first session left him tense and guarded, the second was easier. By the third, He found himself speaking freely, letting out truths he had been carrying like stones in his chest. The counselor didn't try to erase the pain or rewrite his memories. Instead, she helped him understand that surviving wasn't a sign of weakness, but a testament to his resilience. And with every conversation, Daniel felt a little lighter, as if someone were opening windows inside him that had been sealed shut. The bikers invited him to join their weekly community missions, delivering food to shelters, cleaning up neighborhoods, supporting local families in crisis. At first, Daniel watched from the sidelines, unsure how to participate. But soon he noticed something important. Every act of kindness they performed wasn't grand or heroic. It was intentional. It was steady. It was real. One small action at a time, they reminded the world that compassion didn't need applause to matter. Watching this, Daniel felt an unexpected warmth blooming inside him. He wanted to help too, not just because they had helped him, but because helping others made him feel whole again. One afternoon, while loading donation boxes into a truck, Daniel caught his reflection in the window, tired eyes, but clearer than before. Posture still uncertain, but standing taller. A man who had been broken and was learning how to rebuild. He barely recognized himself, yet in a strange way, he finally did. For so long, he had believed his identity was trapped in the shadow of the past. Now, he understood that identity wasn't something fixed. It was something shaped, reshaped, and rediscovered through the people who walked beside you when you had nothing left to give. That night, the bikers gathered around a fire pit behind the clubhouse, flames crackling, sparks rising like tiny fireflies. Someone handed Daniel a mug of hot coffee. Another offered him a worn guitar. Daniel hesitated. He hadn't played in years, but with a gentle nod from the group, he took it. His fingers stumbled at first, rusty and trembling, but slowly the melody emerged, soft and imperfect, yet achingly beautiful. The bikers listened in silence, the firelight reflecting off their leather jackets and thoughtful eyes. When Daniel finished, their applause wasn't loud. It was genuine. It was acceptance. In that moment, surrounded by men who had turned strangers into brothers, Daniel felt something awaken inside him. Purpose. Not the kind forced by duty or expectation, but the kind born from healing, from rising after being torn down. For the first time in so many years, he felt not just alive, but meant to be here. And that realization settled into his soul like embers ready to ignite into something greater. It wasn't long before Daniel's progress caught the attention of the outreach team. They saw the way he connected with other veterans, how his quiet presence brought comfort, how his story opened doors for men too ashamed to speak. One morning, the counselor approached him with an unexpected proposal, a part-time position helping with veteran outreach sessions. Daniel froze, unsure how to respond. He had spent years believing he had nothing left to offer, and now someone wanted him to help guide others. The thought felt overwhelming, and yet deeply right. The counselor simply said, "You've lived what they're trying to survive. That kind of understanding can't be taught." Daniel accepted the role. Though fear gnawed at him the first day, he stepped into the small room where several veterans waited. He recognized the looks, hollow eyes, guarded shoulders, mistrust born from too much disappointment. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. But then he remembered the words he had needed to hear the most when he had nothing. "You're not alone." So he began there. He told them his story, not the polished version, but the raw truth. The humiliation, the hunger, the nights on the street, the crash of dignity, the slow erosion of hope, and the day a group of bikers stormed a store not to fight, but to lift him back into the world. As he spoke, something shifted in the room. Shoulders relaxed, eyes softened. A few nodded, not in pity, but in recognition. His story wasn't just his anymore. It was a bridge, a reminder that even the deepest wounds could heal if someone reached out at the right moment. By the end of the session, several veterans stayed behind, wanted to talk privately. Daniel listened, offering the same respect the bikers had given him. Quiet, patient, real. No judgment, no platitudes, just presence. And that presence became his greatest strength. Outside, the bikers waited for him by their motorcycles, grinning when they saw the spark in his eyes. "How'd it go?" one asked. Daniel looked at them, at the men who had changed his life, and replied with a steady voice, "It went good." Better than I expected." They clapped him on the back, proud, knowing exactly what this moment meant. Daniel wasn't just healing anymore. He was helping others heal too. And that was the beginning of something far bigger than any of them could have predicted. Later that night, Daniel sat alone beneath the stars, letting the cool breeze wash over him. He thought about the man he had been, broken, hungry, unseen, and the man he was becoming, steady, needed, alive. He realized something profound. Sometimes you don't find your calling. Sometimes your calling finds you in the roar of motorcycles, in the kindness of strangers, in the moment someone refuses to let your story end in humiliation. Daniel inhaled deeply, letting the night fill his lungs, and whispered a quiet promise to himself. "I won't waste this second chance." And somewhere deep inside, he felt the truth settle like a heartbeat. He was finally on the road he was meant to ride. Weeks turned into months, and Daniel's life slowly began to anchor itself to something solid, something real. He was no longer drifting through days he barely remembered. Now, each sunrise felt earned, each step intentional. The bikers continued to ride beside him, but not out of obligation, out of respect. They saw the transformation as clearly as the scars on his hands. Daniel was finding his footing again. And one evening, after a long day at the outreach center, the leader pulled him aside. "I think it's time you heard this," he said, handing Daniel a small leather patch. Embroidered on it were 3 simple words: Brothers of Valor. Daniel stared at it, speechless. It wasn't just a symbol. It was belonging. It was a bridge between who he had been and who he was becoming. The leader placed a hand on his shoulder. "There's no test, no initiation," he said. "You've already lived through more than most of us." And you stood back up. "That's all the proof we need." Daniel swallowed hard, emotion thickening his voice. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a stray soul wandering through empty streets. He felt claimed, not as a burden, but as a brother. The patching ceremony happened at sunset, the sky burning orange like a fire that cleanses instead of destroys. The bikers gathered in a circle as Daniel's jacket was adorned with a new patch. When he turned around, the group erupted in cheers and claps on the back. Not loud, aggressive noise, but genuine celebration. He wasn't just someone they helped anymore. He was family. Daniel felt tears sting his eyes. But for once, they weren't from pain. They were from pride, from worth, from being seen. Afterward, the bikers rode out together, taking Daniel on a route that wound through back roads and open fields, a symbolic journey of where he'd come from and where he was going. With the wind rushing past him and the roar of engines vibrating beneath him, Daniel felt something settle inside him. A certainty, a calmness, a sense that the pieces of his life, once shattered and scattered across years of hardship, were finally forming a shape again. And that shape was strong. It was resilient. It was whole. That night, as they sat around a fire sharing quiet conversations and laughter, Daniel realized something he had never dared to believe. He wasn't surviving anymore. He was living, truly living. And the flames dancing before him weren't a reminder of what had burned him, but of what had forged him. The world had tried to break him, but he had risen in a brotherhood that refused to let him fade. One crisp morning, Daniel received a call from the outreach center. A young veteran had arrived, disoriented and defensive, a man not unlike who Daniel had once been. "He won't talk to anyone," the counselor said, "but we think he might talk to you." Daniel's chest tightened, not out of fear, but out of recognition. He understood that silence. He understood that guarded pain. So he grabbed his jacket, now proudly bearing the Brothers of Valor patch, and headed straight there. When he entered the room, the young man didn't look up. His hands trembled. His jaw was clenched. His spirit was wounded in ways only those who carry invisible battles could recognize. Daniel didn't approach him with pity. He didn't speak immediately. He simply sat down across from him and said quietly, "I used to sit the same way you're sitting right now." The young man lifted his eyes slowly, suspicion flickering in them. Daniel continued, "And if someone hadn't stepped in when they did, I don't know if I'd still be here." The young man's expression shifted, not softened, but opened. A crack in the armor. A small one, but enough. Daniel shared his story, not as a lecture, but as a confession. The humiliation at the store, the hunger, the shame, the night the bikers stormed in and treated him like a man worth saving. With each step of the story, the young man's gaze steadied, the weight on his shoulders lifting ever so slightly. By the time Daniel finished, the young veteran whispered, "Why would they do that for you?" Daniel smiled gently. "Because sometimes the world forgets us. But there are people out there who refuse to let us disappear." He leaned forward. "And now, I'm one of them." The room grew quiet, but not tense. Quiet in the way healing begins, softly, without announcement, like dawn breaking slowly across a dark horizon. The young man nodded, his eyes glistening, and for the first time since he arrived, he spoke without trembling. "Can you help me?" Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder. "Yes," he said. "That's why I'm here." Later that evening, back at the clubhouse, the bikers asked how it went. Daniel simply replied, "He's still breathing." "That's the first step." The men nodded. They understood the weight of those words. They had all started from the same place once. Broken, lost, tired. But now, Daniel wasn't just someone they had saved. He was someone who saved others. As night fell, Daniel stepped outside alone, looking toward the horizon where the last hint of sunlight faded. He closed his eyes and let the cool air wash over him. Everything he had endured, the humiliation, the hunger, the loneliness, had led him here. To purpose, to brotherhood, to meaning. He whispered softly into the fading light, "Thank you." Not to the bikers, not to fate, but to the version of himself who didn't give up, even when the world tried to convince him he should. And as the engines roared to life behind him, ready for the next ride, Daniel walked toward them with steady steps, not as a man rescued by chance, but as a brother riding into a future he had finally earned. When Daniel looked back on everything that had happened, the humiliation in the store, the roar of engines that followed, the brotherhood that refused to let him disappear, he realized something profound. The moment that broke him was the same moment that rebuilt him. What began as a single act of cruelty transformed into a ripple of compassion that changed not only his life, but the lives of everyone who crossed his path afterward. His journey wasn't just about being helped. It was about discovering that worth can be restored, dignity can be reclaimed, and a man who once stood invisible can rise and help others be seen. Each chapter of his story echoed the same truth. No one survives alone. Healing doesn't come from the absence of pain. It comes from the presence of people who stand with you when the weight feels unbearable. The bikers didn't rescue Daniel because he was weak. They lifted him because they recognized his strength, even when he had forgotten it himself. And through their brotherhood, Daniel remembered something the world often makes us forget: that compassion is powerful enough to rewrite the ending of anyone's story. As Daniel grew into his new purpose, helping other veterans find their footing, he proved that even the heaviest experiences can become bridges for someone else. The scars he carried were not signs of defeat. They were maps guiding others out of their own darkness. And in lifting others, he found the deepest form of healing, the kind that turns pain into purpose, suffering into service, and silence into strength. His journey became a reminder that sometimes the most broken hearts hold the greatest capacity to restore hope. In the end, Daniel's story wasn't about a man saved by bikers. It was about a man saved by humanity, by the rare but unmistakable force of people choosing kindness over apathy, courage over silence, and unity over judgment. His transformation challenges every viewer to reflect. How many lives around us are one act of compassion away from changing forever? The world is filled with moments that test our character, but it is also filled with chances to step forward, to defend dignity, and to remind someone that they still matter. If this story moved you, if it resonated with something you've lived or witnessed, don't let it end here. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your words may reach someone who needs them more than you know. And if you want to continue receiving stories that inspire, uplift, and remind us of the power we carry to change the world around us, remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Together, we keep these stories alive, and together, we continue the chain of compassion that someone, somewhere is waiting for.